Good afternoon. It's an honor to be here with all of you and to share the stage with Lema Gabawi, a person for whom I have great admiration and from whose experience and wisdom and bravery I have learned a great deal. Afghanistan, where I was born just 6 months after the Soviet invasion, can be counted as one of the most conflict-ridden countries in the world. And in the decades since the Soviets invaded, the country and its people have seen almost continuous war and suffering. That's just to tell you that I've been thinking about war and violence and oppression for quite a long time. Even as a child, like most Afghans, I had very strong respect and admiration for the Mujahideen, the armed resistance that emerged in response to the Soviet invasion and occupation of the country. I saw the Mujahideen as the defenders of the land and its people. And the lesson that I learned from having witnessed and experienced the terrible cost of war and violence was that for many people, it's politically necessary. Now I know that there is a type of action that is just as powerful, if not more powerful, than violent warfare. And it's called nonviolent struggle, also known as civil resistance or people power. Just weeks after 9/11, I began working with Gene Sharp, the foremost scholar on nonviolent resistance. Many of you will have never heard of his name, but for the past 50 years, Gene Sharp has been studying how nonviolent resistance works and has codified that knowledge so that activists today can be more effective in fighting oppression. The Albert Einstein Institution, which he founded and where I serve as the executive director, has been one of the key places where people living under oppression have come for guidance for the past 30 years. Our most well-known book is called From Dictatorship to Democracy, and it's been translated in over 35 languages and has been used by nonviolent movements everywhere from the jungles of Burma to the fall of Milosevic and the Arab Spring.
It's a very good book.
Thank you. In Burma, people found carrying the book were sentenced to 7 years in jail. In Iran, after the Green Uprising, the activists were indicted for allegedly using over 100 of Gene Sharp's 198 methods, a list of specific methods of nonviolent action. Most recently, the members of a book club in Angola were arrested and jailed for studying our work. I've had the privilege to meet many of these brave activists personally and to learn how important our work has been for them. And the success of our work comes from its simplicity. First, we don't focus on the principled rejection of violence on moral grounds. We focus on the historical use of the technique. So when people use nonviolent means of action, how did they actually do it? When nonviolent resistance movements were successful, what made them successful? And when they fail or have failed, what are the factors that have contributed to failure? This research has allowed us to distill important lessons that can be useful for groups that are struggling for social and political objectives today. Nonviolent action carries many misconceptions, and I would bet in this room we have a number of definitions of what it is and what it is not. Nonviolent action is not inaction or pacifism. It is a technique that is based on the social, political, and economic application of basic human stubbornness, the capacity and the willingness to defy, to disrupt, and to refuse to cooperate. So, in other words, people refuse to do the things that they're told to do, and they do that which is forbidden. Nonviolent struggle has been applied in various types of conflict throughout human history, to resist oppression, to undermine dictatorships, to oppose foreign occupations, to protect the environment, to defend the rights of minorities, of workers, of women, people of different sexual orientations, and to expand freedoms of all kinds. Throughout history, nonviolent struggle has been used with great effectiveness and has achieved important successes. This is in spite of the fact that mostly it was being used by people who were operating spontaneously in an improvised fashion, with almost no strategic planning and very little tactical planning. After having conducted her nonviolent struggle, in which she led thousands of people to win a historic victory for her country, Leymah Gbowee was surprised to learn when she went to university to study conflict resolution that there was a whole body of work dedicated to what she had done through intuition, that there was a language, a structure, a whole system. We hear this sentiment expressed time and time again. People are surprised to learn that nonviolent struggles have been studied and that the lessons have been collected and are available to them. During the Lithuanian independence movement against the Russian occupation in 1991, Audrys Butkevičius, the Minister of Defense, told his fellow ministers, "I would rather have this book rather than the nuclear bomb." He was referring to From Dictatorship to Democracy. What he meant was that the use of civil resistance in a strategic plan was much more powerful and useful than the most powerful weapon of war. Rarely we have seen great strategic geniuses like Gandhi, but Gandhi was a brilliant political strategist who was able to plan and wage the Indian independence movement using his own intuition, a deep insight into political power, historical knowledge, understanding of his own people, and also of the opponents he faced. But for most people, relying on intuition can lead to defeat. Nonviolent activists throughout the world are getting better at grabbing headlines. But these isolated actions do very little if they're not part of a larger strategic plan. A general wouldn't march troops into battle unless he had a plan to win the war. Yet this is how most of the world's nonviolent activists have historically operated. Nonviolent struggle is just as complex as military warfare, if not more. Its participants must be well-trained and have clear objectives, and its leaders must have a plan of how to win those objectives. The technique of war has been developed over thousands of years with massive resources and some of our best minds dedicated to understanding and improving how it works. Meanwhile, nonviolent struggle is rarely systematically analyzed and studied. And although the number is growing, there are still only a few dozen people in the world who are teaching it. While military officers return to their academies to refight the lost battles of the past and to learn from mistakes, the experience of the success and failures of nonviolent action has often been lost. This is dangerous because we now know that our old approaches for dealing with conflict are not adequate for the new challenges that we face. We need more international efforts to strengthen access to the tools that can make nonviolent action more effective than it has been in the movements of the past. We need to invest in organizations and initiatives that can support the efforts of brave nonviolent activists throughout the world. And this doesn't mean telling people what to do. At the Albert Einstein Institution, we provide generic knowledge through our publications, consultations, and workshops in order to share our experience and knowledge on how nonviolent action works so people can explore its use for their own situations. But different institutions will have different resources and expertise to offer. It's not enough just to denounce violence and oppression, or just to symbolically express dissent. What is needed is to strengthen people and to strengthen existing institutions, networks, and systems, and to build new ones. This is where the work of civil society, your work, comes in. Protests in the streets make for good pictures in newspapers and televisions, but on their own, they don't create strength and power to sustain movements. What's needed is to build alternative institutions, and again, to strengthen existing ones. What Gandhi called constructive programs. The goal here is to build capacity among ordinary people by creating institutions, new centers of power that can challenge the status quo. Gandhi recognized that weak people cannot be expected to take effective action against powerful opponents. He said it was like a paralyzed hand attempting to lift a spoon. The end of political violence is closely associated with our ability to find new ways of conducting conflict, new ways of organizing power in society, and with the need to strengthen the capacity of ordinary people. People who may feel powerless today, but who can develop the capacity to change their societies and to change the world. This is especially true because people are increasingly waging struggles while facing opponents who have massive resources at their disposal. Opponents that control the media, that control the banks and transportation systems and financial systems, and also the tools of violent repression, the police, the military, and the prisons. And these opponents are constantly learning and developing better techniques to defeat movements, which means that activists must also innovate if they have a chance of winning this nonviolent arms race. My work at the MIT Media Lab is now allowing me to fuse the 30 years of experience of the Albert Einstein Institution with some of the world's best technologists. We're pulling together a team to create a toolbox for nonviolent activists, which will help movements conduct effective resistance in increasingly hostile environments against opponents who are using the full range of resources, technological and otherwise, to crush dissent. I've been delighted to meet so many of you here at this conference doing inspiring work, and I look forward to working with you and drawing on your knowledge in the coming year. We are at a time when the line between dictatorships and democracies are becoming increasingly more difficult to define. Democracies around the world are restricting the freedoms and rights of their citizens. Meanwhile, dictatorships are employing the facade of elections, negotiations, media manipulation, and legislative bodies to give a facade of respect for human rights and political rights. The creation of state-sponsored civilian groups to intimidate and block the work of democracy movements and NGOs will increasingly be a challenge. Democracy is not a system that, once achieved in a society, means we get to sit back and relax. It requires constant vigilance and engagement by its citizens. Otherwise, the rights that so many have worked so hard for can be eroded. We see many examples of that, both in your country and mine. Democratic constitutions and procedures are, in the end, only pieces of paper. And if those in positions of power think that they can act with impunity and that the people will not stop them, then the abuses of power that we see around the world should not be so surprising to us. In dictatorships, most people recognize this, but in democracies, we sometimes forget it. Nonviolent action doesn't depend on written documents or the promises of leaders. It depends on the empowerment of people and institutions that can insist that leaders serve the interests of the people that elect them. The power of nonviolent action comes from building the strength and capacity of people. And with that strength, people can fight for the society they want and then defend it from being taken away. For those here today who have battled for years to protect rights and freedoms, and for those just starting out, thank you. We face a huge challenge. I've been struck by the stories here of lost colleagues and contacts, the voices from the dark that go silent, never to be heard from again. We work for these people, some of whose faces we know, and many more we will never see or hear. In this year ahead, I look forward to joining our missions. Together, we are a vital source in the support of freedom. Thank you very much.